We've seen how to create Django models in the previous video that map to database tables in the database. In this video, we're going to see how we can query that database to pull records or information out of the tables into our Django models, and we're also going to see how to programmatically create rows in the database using the Django ORM. And we're also going to see how to programmatically work with foreign keys in the Django ORM in order to join tables together and get various bits of information out of those tables. So let's get started. Now I have a models.py file open. This contains the models we created in the last video. We have a restaurant model that tracks restaurant details. Below that we have a rating model, and this stores information about the ratings that users have given to restaurants. And finally we have a sale model, and this tracks the sales that have been taken in by a given restaurant. So that has a foreign key to the restaurant model. We're going to see how to work programmatically with that in this video a bit later on. Now in this video we're going to work within a script called ormscript.py, and this is an empty file at the moment that lives within a scripts directory in the core application. And what we're going to do here is we're going to reference some documentation from Django extensions. I'll link this page below the video. It's for a command called runscript, and this is part of Django extensions, and it allows you to execute an arbitrary set of Python commands within the context of a Django application. So it loads in all of those utilities such as your Django models and all the utilities provided under the hood by Django into the context, and in order to use that, what you do is you make a scripts directory and you can create different files within that directory. And as you can see here, we also need an init.py within the scripts directory, so I'm going to create that file here, call it init.py, and we have a file called ormscript.py, and what we need to do is define a function called run, and the code within this function is what's executed by the Django extensions runscript command. So I'm going to say hello from runscript here, and now we need to execute this. So let's bring the terminal up, and I'm going to execute the python manage.py, and it's the run script command, and the name of that script should match the file. In our case it's called ormscript. When we execute that, we should see the print statement, and you can see that below. Now in the previous video we created these models here that you see, but we don't have any data in the database for these models. We just have the tables with the columns that we created in the last video. What we're going to do in this video is create some new records in the tables, and then we can query them using Django. So the question that we're going to start with is, how do we get data into these database tables using Django? Now one way to do it is to use the Django admin UI and manually enter the data through forms. We're not going to cover that in this video because we want to see how to do this programmatically. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our ormscript.py file, and we're going to write some code underneath this run method in order to actually interact with the database using the Django models that we created. So at the top, I'm going to bring an import in. From the core modules models.py file, we're importing the restaurant model that we created in the last video. And now we're going to see how we can actually create data in the database for the restaurant. Now the first method that we're going to cover is simply to instantiate the model. So let's create a variable called restaurant, and we can instantiate the class of restaurant here, and that will store that in the variable called restaurant. Now this has not created anything in the database, because when you instantiate a model this way, we need to fill in the data for each field, and after we've done that we can call a method called save on the model in order to save that to the database. So right now if we go to the SQLite browser and we go to the restaurant table and we browse that table, you can see that we have no rows in the table, we have no data. So let's now go back and we can see how to fill in the fields of this restaurant model in order to actually create a row in the database. So I'm going to say that the restaurant.name property, let's say that's equal to my Italian restaurant here. Now notice that we have an instance of the model. So if we go to models.py, we have this restaurant model, and an instance of the model should map to a row in the underlying table. Now right now, of course, we don't have that row in the table. We're going to build this model up and then call the save method. But what we're doing here is we're accessing one of the fields on the model, and that's the name field that you see here. It's a car field, and that name field maps to this column here called name in the underlying table. Now what we're going to do is we're going to fill in all of these required fields. Now you might note that the website is not required. It has a default value of an empty string, so we're not going to bother with that one, but we need to fill in the date opened, the latitude, the longitude, and also the restaurant type. So let's go back to the script and let's start with the latitude and longitude. So I'm going to say restaurant.latitude. Let's give it a random latitude number here, and I'm going to copy that down to the longitude here and rename the fields. So we're setting the latitude and the longitude fields on the restaurant model. And remember, right now we're just setting some fields on a Python class. nothing is actually saved to the database at the moment. Let's now set the restaurant's date opened field. So it's going to be restaurant.dateOpened, and we need to set this equal to a date instance. So what I'm going to do at the top is from Django.utils, I'm going to bring in an import of the time zone module, and we can set the date opened equal to timezone.now for this demo. So we've set the name, the latitude, the longitude, and the date opened. If we go back to models.py, we also need to set the restaurant type. So we're going to copy the name of that field, and I'm going to say restaurant.restaurant type, and we're going to set that equal to the restaurant model's type choices.Italian. Remember, the type choices is coming from this models.textChoices subclass. And this defines the choices that are applicable and are used here in the restaurant type field. So what we are doing is we're referencing this inner class called type choices, and we're referencing the Italian value. And this is an Italian restaurant, so it makes sense to set the type equal to that. So that's all the required fields on the model. What we can do now is call the function that's actually going to save it to the underlying database. And that's the model.save function, in our case restaurant.save. So the save function is available on any non-abstract Django model class, and it's responsible for saving the data to the database. Now, if you're saving a new record, it's going to actually create the row in the database, but you can also use this function to update existing data. So for example, you can pull out a restaurant row from the database into a Django model. You can change one or as many fields as you like and then call save, and it's going to actually update that in the database rather than create a new record. So now that we've done this, let's bring up our terminal again, and I'm going to run this script, and we're going to see that that creates a row in our database. The script is finished, so let's go back to the SQLite browser and refresh this table, and you can see we now have some data in the table, and it's correctly filling in the name of the restaurant as My Italian Restaurant. The date opened is set to the current date that I'm filming this video, and we also have a latitude and longitude value and the restaurant time equal to Italian. And because we didn't specify a website, that remains the default value, which is an empty string. But the key method that's used in order to save this data to the database, of course, is the restaurant.save method. So it's very important, if you're a Django programmer, to know about the save method. So now that we have data, how do we actually query the database in order to pull the data out into our Django application? So what I'm going to do is just remove all of this code just now, and I'm going to create a new variable called restaurants here. And what we're going to do is we're going to see another function here. It's going to be restaurant.objects.all. Now this .objects property, it's called a manager in Django, and this is an interface through which you can do querying operations to the underlying database. And the query that we're doing is the .all query, which will pull all of the rows from the restaurant table into the application, and in our case we're storing that in a variable called restaurants. And we can print these restaurants to the terminal, so I'm going to print these out, and we can go back to our script and run this. And you can see the output of that is a query set containing one restaurant. So when we use this function restaurant.objects.all, it takes all of the rows in the underlying table and it brings them and pulls them out into a query set, and each record in the query set is a populated Django model containing the data from the database. And that data structure is called a query set, and that's kind of like a list in Python. Now we're going to see later on that when we get back a query set, such as from this method here, we can then chain additional methods on to perform different types of logic on the query set. So query sets are chainable, and we can build up some very flexible SQL statements using these query sets. Now you might be wondering, what is the actual query being performed under the hood? So what I'm going to do is bring in the connection object from the Django database module, and I'm going to comment this print statement out, and I'm going to print out the connection.queries attribute, and that's a list of all of the SQL queries that have been executed in the context of this script. If we go back to the terminal and execute this again, we're going to see that there are no queries that are being executed, and that's because even though we have this statement here getting all of the restaurants from the database, it's never actually evaluated, and that's because Django query sets are lazily evaluated. We're pulling the restaurants out into the variable called restaurants, but that's never used in the application, and Django is sensible enough to know that if it's not being used, there is no point in going to the database and fetching that data. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring back the print statement that will evaluate the restaurants that we have in the database, and that's going to force that query set to be evaluated, and therefore the connection.queries list is going to be populated by that SQL query. So let's get back to the terminal, and we're going to re-execute the script, and we can see now we have an SQL statement that's being executed, and that's a select statement that's selecting various fields from the core restaurant table in the database, and that's this table here that you can see with the single row that we added, the restaurant table. So let's get back to VS Code, and what we're going to do now is we're going to learn about a couple of extra queries that we can perform. So we know now that the restaurant.objects.all query returns a query set containing all of the rows in the database table. What we can do if we just want the first record in the table is we can remove .all and we can use the restaurant.objects.first method. This will return the first row that we have in the given table, the restaurant table. So let's now change the name of this variable to restaurant, and we're going to see that this does not return a query set because we're only getting one row from the database. It actually just returns the model instance that represents that row. So let's now go back to the terminal and we'll clear this terminal and re-execute the script. You can see the print statement here has the name of the restaurant, that's 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝘁𝗲𝗏, and the query below is limited to a single object that's being returned. And we can see this a little bit better, I think, if we use the Python manage.py_shell+ command. This is from Django extensions 2, and that has a flag called print SQL that you can use in order to see the SQL statements that are being evaluated. So let's fetch the first object in the database and we can see the SQL that's executed. We're selecting all of the columns from the restaurant table, we're ordering it by the primary key, which is the ID column, and we're limiting to a single instance. So that will return a single row, which is then converted to a Django model instance for that row. Now, as well as using the .first method, what we can do is go back to the restaurant.objects.all method, and we can use Python indexing notation in order to index into this query set and get as many records at particular indexes as we want. So for example, for us, if we want to get the equivalent of restaurant.objects.first, we will index in at element 0 to get the first record from that table. And again, if we go back to the terminal and run this script, we're going to see that we get a SQL statement that's limited to a single result. So far we've seen how to create a model by instantiating the model and filling out the fields and then calling the .save method. We've also seen how to use the restaurant.objects.all method to pull all records from a table. And we've also seen how to use the restaurant.objects.first method in order to pull out the very first row from the database table. We're now going to see a second way to create records, and that's using restaurant.objects.create. So I'm going to keep the connection.queries list here and I'm going to delete the code above that. Now the second way to create rows in Django is to use the restaurant.objects.create function. So all Django models, if they're using the default manager, they have a function called .create, and you can use that directly to create the model, and therefore you don't need to call the .save method after that. And that takes keyword arguments that represent the fields on the model. For example, I can set the name of the restaurant here to pizza shop. We can also set the restaurant's date opened, again to timezone.now. And because this is a pizza restaurant, we're going to set the restaurant type to Italian again. And let's just give this a random latitude and longitude. So what this is going to do is execute this query and it's going to create that row in the database. So let's go back to our terminal here and we're going to run this script. And you can see this time the SQL statement is an insert into statement, and we're inserting data into the restaurant table. And you can see the values being inserted match what we have specified on the model class, and the query will return the restaurant's ID. So that's an insert into statement to actually create new data in the database table. If we go back to SQLite browser and refresh this page, you can see we now have a second restaurant called Pizza Shop. And if we go back to this script and execute it again, we're going to see that that insert into statement will once again be run, and we'll now have 3 records in the database. Now what I'm going to do is go back to our ORM script.py and I'm going to change this method, and we're going to again fetch all of the restaurants in the database, and I'm going to print those out to the terminal. And for now I'm going to comment out connection.queries, and we're going to go back to the terminal and I'm going to run the ORM script.py. You can see now that we get a query set containing 3 records for each restaurant that we now have in this database table. So the restaurant.objects.all method will return all of those to us. So let's go back to the script and we're going to see some different methods now that we can use. As well as .all, we can use the .count method, and that's going to return the number of rows in the database table. And if we uncomment connection.queries, we're going to see what that actually looks like as an SQL query. So let's get back to the terminal and we're going to execute the script. You can see the number printed out by the .count method is 3, and that's because we've got 3 rows in the table. And below that you can see the SQL statement where we select the count of all the records from the core restaurant table. That's the SQL that's actually executed by Django, or it's built up by Django when you use the objects.count method on a model. And it's worth noting, we've already seen the .first method, but we also have a .last method as well, and that's going to return the last record in the database. If we go back to the terminal and we execute this, we can see the SQL query that's executed for that one. When we order by the ID column, that's the default ordering in a Django model, we're also specifying a descending parameter to the SQL statement, and that's going to order the ID from the top down, so from the highest ID down to the lowest, and the row with the maximum ID is what's going to be returned to the caller. And again, if we use the shell plus command with the print SQL flag and we execute that statement, and that's restaurant.objects.last, you can see that we're ordering by the ID in descending order. So we're now going to move on and look at how we can query against foreign keys in Django. Let's focus on the rating model here. You can see that that has a foreign key to both the restaurant model as well as also the user model. And the reason the rating has a foreign key to the restaurant is because the rating belongs to a restaurant. So a user might go in and give a restaurant 3 out of 5 stars. That rating is tied to the restaurant by the foreign key. And in the other direction, which is the reverse side of the relation, a restaurant has many ratings. Let's see how we can query that with Django. So this is a one-to-many relationship. One restaurant has many ratings, but one instance of a rating is tied to one particular restaurant. And for that kind of relationship, you can model it with a foreign key field on a Django model. What we're going to do is go back to our script and we're going to remove these queries here. And we're going to fetch the first restaurant from the database. So it's going to be restaurant.objects.first. And we're also going to fetch the first user from the database, so that's going to be user.objects.first. And we need to import Django's user model, which I'm going to do at the very top of this file from django.contrib.auth.models. We are importing the user model. So now we have a model instance for a restaurant and also for a user. What we're going to do now is create a rating. So let's also bring the rating model in at the top here from core.models. We can import rating, and then just below here we can use the rating.objects.create function. Now what we need to do is tie the rating to a user and a restaurant. And in order to do that, we have these instances of the models. We can simply use them and reference them in this create function. So we're going to set the user equal to that user that we have here on line 8. And we can set the restaurant equal to the restaurant instance that we pulled out on line 7 here. Now remember, these are just Python objects, they're instances of the model classes that represent a row in the underlying table, and we are simply attaching that instance as a keyword argument to the create function in order to create the foreign key reference. And finally, as well as the two foreign keys, we need to add a rating itself, and that's done through this rating field. We're going to attach a rating, let's say, of 3 stars out of 5 for this particular rating. Let's go back to the terminal and run the script again. If we now go back to the SQLite browser and we go to the core rating table, you can see we now have a row in this table. The rating is 3 out of 5 stars, and you can see the two foreign keys to the right here. We have a restaurant ID of 2 and a user ID of 1. So what's happening if we look at this row here is that Django is taking the model instance, which is a Python class, and it's automatically taking that model and it's storing the correct reference to that model's primary key as the foreign key on this rating. So for the restaurant that this rating is applied to, it's taken the Django model for the restaurant and it's extracted its primary key. And when we save the rating with the rating.objects.create function, what's happening is it's going to the database and it's storing the foreign key reference as the number 2 here. So Django does that all transparently for us through the ORM. It does it in an object-oriented manner, and that can be a lot more convenient than having to write the SQL and do these kind of joins and operations yourself. And just like with the restaurant model, if we remove all of this code, what we can do is we can print out rating.objects.all, and if we go back to the terminal and re-execute this script, we're going to get a query set back. We now have that one row coming back in the query set representing that given rating. So this rating has 3 out of 5 stars. What we're going to do now is introduce another couple of methods in the Django ORM, as well as pulling all of the ratings out of the database. Very frequently you want to filter the ratings, and instead of getting every row, you want to filter based on a condition, and you can do that with the rating.objects.filter function. And what you pass to rating is a condition. So for example, we could search for all ratings where the rating number is equal to 3. And if we duplicate that line down below and search for all ratings that have 5 out of 5 stars, we can then go back to our terminal and re-execute this script. You can see at the top we get the rating matching 3 out of 5 stars for that single row, but for the second operation where we're getting all equal to 5 stars, you can see that's an empty query set, and that's because we don't have any ratings in this table where we have 5 out of 5 stars. The only rating we have is 3 out of 5 stars. So what the filter function does is it takes the condition that you give it and it then filters down all of the rows in the database to a subset of rows based on those rows which match the condition. So the question is, how do we do that in the SQL? You might remember from the previous video that you can filter based on conditions using a where clause. Let's comment out this rating equals 5 and we can bring back the connection.queries attribute. And if we go back to the terminal and re-execute the script again, you can see the select statement this time has a where clause applied to it. And that where clause will look at the rating field and look for all values that are equal to 3. Now, as well as doing an equality lookup, we can do various different types of lookup. For example, we can look for all ratings that are greater than or equal to 3. And this is called a lookup in the Django ORM. We take one of the fields, which is in this case the rating field. We use 2 underscores and then we can perform a lookup. And in our case, the lookup is greater than or equal. And we're going to find all ratings that are greater than or equal to 3. So let's see in the terminal how that translates to an SQL statement. Rather than the rating being equal to 3, we now have a greater than or equal to operator. And that will then allow us to get all of the rows where we have at least 3 out of 5 stars. Up to 5 out of 5 stars. And as you can imagine, Django has various different types of lookups. For example, we could put less than or equal to here, and that's going to invert that operator to less than or equal to, as you can see here. And this is very commonly used in Django apps when you need to get some records from the database based on some sort of condition. We use the .filter function in order to do that, and it has an opposite function, and that's called .exclude. And when we use exclude, the condition that's passed to that function is actually what's not going to be brought back from the database. Anything that doesn't match the condition will be returned. And if we go back to the terminal and re-execute this SQL, you can see that this is exactly the same, except instead of a where clause, it's now a where not clause. And again, just for formatting, I'm going to use the shell plus command. I'm going to paste that command in here and we can see the SQL in a better formatting. So here is the key line for the exclude function. It takes the condition that we pass as an argument, and instead of just using that as a where clause, it inverts that using the where not operator. So this is very similar to the filter function, which simply is a where clause. And you can use these interchangeably, the exclude function and the filter function, depending on what you want to achieve in your code. Now what I want to do quickly is demonstrate something else we can do with the model.save method. Let's say we fetch a restaurant here from the database with the restaurant.objects.first function. Remember, the .first function will return a model instance, so we can actually print out the attributes of that model, for example, restaurant.name. And if we go back to the terminal and execute this script, you see we get back the name of the restaurant as well as the SQL statement. Now what I'm going to do is actually change one of these attributes. And this is going to demonstrate how we can update values in the database for a particular column or set of columns from one value to another. So let's go back to our code, and what I'm going to do is change the name of this restaurant. And we can do that by accessing the property.name and just giving it another value. So currently this restaurant is called My Italian Restaurant. Let's change that value now. And let's just give this a value of some random text. And to actually persist the change to the database, we need to call restaurant.save. Now before we run this, I'm going to import from the Python pprint module, the pprint function. And we're actually going to pretty print these connection.queries, and that's because we're actually executing 2 queries now, and we want to see these one after the other. So let's go back to the terminal and we're executing this script, and you can see the 2 SQL statements. Firstly, we get the object from the database with the restaurant.objects.first function, and then when we call the .save function, what's happening if we go back to the terminal is we are actually sending an update statement to the database. And an update statement is when we want to actually change values that exist already in the database. We're not creating anything new, we're simply updating an existing value. And the update statement here is setting the name equal to that random garbage that we entered. And it's doing that where the restaurant's ID is equal to 2, and that matches what's being pulled out of the database above. So if we now go back to the SQLite browser and go to the restaurant table here, we still have 3 rows in the table, nothing new has been created, but we now have this new name for the first restaurant. So the important point here is that when we pull out existing records from the database and we update fields and call .save, it's not going to use the insert into SQL statement and create new data. It's going to instead use an update statement and update some of the data in the database. So let's now remove this code here. And what we're going to do is now demonstrate how Django builds up a join statement in SQL. So let's grab a rating from the database. That's the rating.objects.first command. And we can print out the rating.rating attribute. Now that's a bit confusing, but the object is called rating and it has an attribute called rating here. If we print that out and execute the script, we're going to see the rating is 3 out of 5 stars. Now the rating also has a foreign key to a restaurant model. So what I'm going to do is print out the rating.restaurant. And if we go back to the terminal, let's clear this out and re-execute the script. You can see we now have 2 SQL commands coming back here. The first one is fetching the rating from the database, and that's the rating.objects.first command. And I'm calling these commands, but they're actually just function calls here that are going to the database and bringing back data. And the second operation is when we access the rating.restaurant. If we look at the query that's being executed, you can see we have a select statement, and that's selecting data from the core restaurant table this time, and that's because we're accessing the foreign key to the restaurant, and we're accessing that data where the restaurant's ID is 2. Now the question is, where is this 2 coming from? If we look at the rating table, you can see the restaurant ID is 2, and when we pull out the rating with this line of code here, rating.objects.first, that rating has this restaurant attribute and it's set to 2 initially, but what Django will do is actually perform the query to get the associated restaurant. So Django will automatically build up that query in order to get the additional data, and then we can access additional fields such as the name. If we go back to the terminal and re-execute this script, we get back the name of that restaurant. Now what we're going to see is something a bit different now. It's very easy to go from the rating model to its parent restaurant, which is the foreign key. But what if we have a restaurant model, which is the first model here, and we want to get all of the ratings for that restaurant? Now we don't have a field on the restaurant model that refers to the ratings, and that's because the reference is defined on the child object, the rating, where we have a reference to the parent restaurant. So what we need to do if we have a restaurant and we want to get its ratings is we need to use a special construct in Django. So I'm going to go to the documentation. We have this following relationships backward section, which I'll link below the video. If a model has a foreign key, instances of the foreign key model will have access to a manager that returns all instances of the first model. And by default, this manager is called 𝗵_set, where 𝗵 is the source model name. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go back to VS Code and we're going to go to the ORM script.py. And we're going to demonstrate how to do this. So let's clear out this code here, and let's say we have our restaurant model that we're going to get from the database with the restaurant.objects.first command. Now if we want to get all of the ratings associated with this restaurant, we can use the restaurant.rating_set, and that gives us back a manager, and we can then chain additional functions to that manager, such as the .all function. So restaurant.ratingset.all will give us back all of the ratings associated with this restaurant. What we're doing is taking an instance of the restaurant and we're going to the reverse side of this relationship that's defined on the rating, the foreign key from the rating to the restaurant. We're doing that in reverse by accessing this rating set manager and then the .all function. So let's comment out the connection.queries and go back to the terminal. And we're going to execute this script, and you can see we get back a query set consisting of 1 rating. So that given restaurant that we fetch with the restaurant.objects.first function, we can access all of its ratings with ratingset.all, and in this case we only have 1 rating for the restaurant, so it gives us back that single rating. Now sometimes you want to override the name of this reverse relation. Instead of model_set, you can give it your own custom name. So how do we do that? Let's go back to models.py and we're going to go to where the relationship is defined, and that's here on line 29. This is a foreign key field to the restaurant model, but what we can add is another keyword argument here, and that keyword argument is related_name. And we can set this to a string, which is going to become the name of that associated reverse manager. So if we had a restaurant and we wanted to get all of its ratings, a sensible name here would be ratings. Let's now go back to the ORM script.py, and we can now access all of these ratings with restaurant.ratings.all. So for the given restaurant, this is going to return all of its ratings. If we go back to the terminal now and execute this, we get back the same query set. And what we can also do if we go back to models.py is if we can look at the sale model here, we can add a related name here to the restaurant field. So related_name, And if we have a restaurant and we want to get all of its sales, a sensible related name would be sales. So let's finish this video by actually creating a few sales. If we go back to this script here and we remove this code, we can create sales with the sale.objects.create method. We can tie that to a restaurant with the restaurant parameter, and we're going to set that equal to the first restaurant in the database. That returns, remember, a single instance. Let's set an income value. In our case, we'll just set that equal to a random number. And the final field on the sale is the datetime field. We can set that equal to datetime, or rather timezone.now, timezone coming from this Django module at the top here. And of course we also need to import the sale model at the top. So that will create one sale record when we run the script. I'm going to copy that below, and we have 3 instances of this, and I'm going to change the income numbers a little bit just so we have a bit of diversity in the table. And what we're going to do is go back to the terminal, and I'm going to rerun the script, and this is going to create 3 sale instances in the database. If we go to the SQLite browser and we go to the core sale table, you can now see we have 3 rows in the table representing those sales, and they're all tied to restaurant number 2 in the database. So restaurant number 2 has 3 sales. Let's fetch that restaurant from the database table. So that was restaurant.objects.first. That will give us back that first database record, and we can then print out the sales with the restaurant.sales.all statement, and that's going to return all of the sales. This, remember, refers to the new related name that we defined on the foreign key here. So we have this foreign key, and I'm going to bring this to a new line, and you can see our related name of sales. We're referencing that here, and that's a manager, so we can then call .all. If we run the script, we now get a query set with the 3 sale objects that are in that table. Now I'm going to finish this video with one final method that we can use in the ORM, and that's the get or create method. And as the name implies, this is going to try and get a record from the database based on the values we provide. And if one does not exist, it's then going to create that record for us. So let's remove this code here. And what we're going to do is try and create a new rating in the database. So let's fetch the user that we want to apply this rating to. So that's going to be user.objects.first. And we can also get the first restaurant in the database, and that's going to be restaurant.objects.first. And what we want to do is use the get or create method here in order to try and retrieve a rating from the database if it exists for this user and restaurant. So what I'm going to do is print the result of this statement out, and the statement is going to be rating.objects.get or create. And to the get or create function we pass some parameters that we want to check the database for. And if a record exists that matches the values we provide, it's then going to return the object to us. If not, it's going to create the object. So let's see that now. We're going to set the restaurant for this rating equal to the restaurant we fetched on line 9 above. And we'll also set the user here to the user from line 8. And we're going to set the rating, in this case let's say 4 out of 5 stars for this restaurant by this user. So the restaurant.objects.get or create function, it takes these keyword arguments that reference the fields on the model, and it's going to perform a database lookup for these fields, and if a record exists it's going to return the model to us, and again if not it's going to create the record. So let's print out the connection.queries below. In fact I'm going to use the pprint function here, and we can print out connection.queries. And let's now go back to the terminal and we can execute the script. And you can see the print statement is returning a tuple with 2 objects. The first object is the instance, the model instance for this rating. And the second parameter in that tuple is a boolean. It's going to be true or false. And basically this boolean value that's returned from the get or create function, this will tell us whether or not the object that's been returned has been created in the database for the first time, or whether it's just been retrieved from the database. So if it's been created, that value will be true. If it's not been created, if it's just been fetched with the get method, then that's going to be false. Let's go back to the terminal and we can look at the SQL statements that have been executed here. Now the top 2 are just fetching the user and the restaurant from the database, and that's these 2 lines of code on line 8 and 9. We're interested in the line of code from line 11 to 15 here, so let's go back to the terminal. And you can see that 2 SQL statements have been executed here. You can see this top one here, we are trying to fetch a record where the rating is equal to 4, the restaurant is equal to the given restaurant that we passed in, and also the user is equal to that user as well. So it does that select statement in the database to try and find the record, and if it doesn't find the record based on these parameters, what's going to happen is it's going to create that record, and it's going to use an insert into statement to do that. So it doesn't find the record in this case in the database with those values, so then it creates an insert statement and it actually adds them to the rating table. Now what happens if we clear this script and re-execute the code? You can see at the top the tuple now has a false value for its second index, and that's because the rating has no longer been created. And you can see in the SQL below, when we perform the select lookup, it finds a record in the database, and therefore we don't get the insert statement below that. So it's not trying to insert any more objects into the table. Instead, we get back the object, and the reason for that is because these parameters we've specified, the restaurant, the user and the rating, there is a match for all of these values in the database. So the get or create function is going to get that from the database and return the model instance to us. And we can see that model instance in the tuple that's returned here, and it's this object here with rating 4. So that's how get or create works. It basically tries to retrieve something from the database with a select statement, and if it does find it, it will return it to you, but if it doesn't, it's going to then create the database object with an insert into statement. So if we go back to the code here, what we can do is I'm going to remove the print statement, and because get or create returns a tuple, we can actually destructure that. So I'm going to say rating and created is equal to the return from this get or create function. So we have a rating, which is the model instance, and we have a created Boolean true or false value. And once you've destructured these returned objects from the get or create function, what you might commonly do in a Django application is check the value of the created Boolean, and if it's true, you might perform some sort of action. And you can imagine, for example, a user object, you might use the get or create function to either fetch or create a user. And if the user has been created, you might want to send an email to that user for the first time with some instructions or some welcome message or something. So this created Boolean can be used in your Django apps, and the get or create function is very useful if you want to actually add an object to the database if it doesn't already exist. But if you also want to avoid adding duplicates of a given object to the database based on a set of values. So that's all for this video. We've covered a number of different functions in this video. We've looked at how to actually create objects in the database with Django, and we can do that in a variety of ways. We can instantiate an object, fill in the values, and then call the .save method, and we can also use the Model.objects.create method to actually directly create the object in the database. And we've also now seen this additional method of creating objects, the get or create function, where you first perform a lookup, and if that object doesn't exist, you then create it. And as well as object creation, we've seen how to query the database to get data from it into our Django apps. For example, using the Model.objects.all method to get all rows from a table into your app as a query set. And we've also seen a couple of other query set methods for filtering, and that's the .filter method and the .exclude method. And we also saw a few methods that return instances rather than query sets, the .first method and the .last method. And we also saw the .count method for returning the number of rows in a table, or the number of models that you have in a query set after you perform some sort of filtering operations or any other operations using the ORM. And finally, in this video, we've seen how to work with foreign keys in order to access related models, and also how to do the reverse relations, and how to use related managers for that. Now, before we end the video, I'd just like to mention a few things. If you're interested in what I've been doing, for example these SQL statements, then please let me know in the comments, or if you're not interested in this, let me know too. I think it's very beneficial to understand what's going on under the hood in a Django system. For example, when you're constructing SQL queries, it can be important to know how databases work and what the best and most efficient ways of querying those databases are. But if you're not interested, just let me know. I can maybe stop doing that so much as well. And the final caveat, at the moment we're working with very little data in the database. Later on, I'm going to create a script that's going to load up many records into the tables so we can get a more realistic feel when we are actually querying that database and doing filtering operations, aggregation, and many more. So thanks again for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.